All right, thank you. So hi, everyone. So whether you're scripting with Python, analyzing data, or building websites, your choice of developer tool is probably one of the most important things that you can make in terms of your own personal productivity. And today, developers are increasingly choosing Visual Studio Code as their developer tool. It's ranked as the #1 tool on Stack Overflow's developer survey in 2018. And I'm going to show you today how you can make the most out of using Visual Studio Code for Python to get the most out of that, to be productive with it. And so I'm Dan Taylor. I'm a program manager for our Python developer tools at Microsoft. I actually grew up just down the road in Cambridge, Ontario. And so I'm excited to be here to share with you some of the tips and tricks I have today. So whether you're using Visual Studio Code currently or totally new to it, never seen it before, I guarantee you'll learn some interesting tips and tricks in today's talk. So for those of you who are new to Visual Studio Code, never seen it before, what is it? So it's a free cross-platform and open source developer tool from Microsoft. It's fast and lightweight, and it's got a really rich extension ecosystem. And it was originally built as a JavaScript tool, so it's got built-in support for JavaScript and TypeScript, so if you're a web developer, that's very handy. And it has rich features like IntelliSense, debugging, and source control. So if you want to use Visual Studio Code with Python, you need to also add the Python extension from Microsoft. And this adds Python support, so IntelliSense, completions, debugging, linting, testing, refactoring. We have black support built in too. That's a popular formatting tool. And so interestingly, Python is the most popular extension on the Visual Studio Code marketplace. You can see up there we've got more than 22 million downloads of it. And this is the fastest growing language in Visual Studio Code. So it's gaining popularity very quickly amongst Python developers. And so fun fact, this was actually originally built as open source, built by a member of the community, Don J. Money. And it gained in popularity. We loved the work that he was doing. So we hired him on as Microsoft and then republished the Python extension as Microsoft. Actually, you can't see the date there, but that's November 9th. So that's 1 year ago yesterday. So happy birthday to the Python extension. So thank you. So we published this as Microsoft 1 year ago, and we've been doing a new release of it every month. And most of the features that I'll be showing today are actually new or improved since that original release. So I'm very excited to share with you. So one quick note before I get into the rest of the talk. One of the key hesitations I hear from people about trying Visual Studio Code is that I have to reprogram my hands in order to use it because of keyboard shortcuts. So just wanted to note that we've got key bindings for Vim, Sublime Text, Emacs, and IntelliJ. So you can really easily get started if you install those extensions. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to be taking an application kind of through a live coding session through 3 different stages. First, I'll do some basic scripting, and I'll be showing how you install VS Code, set up your interpreter, and do some editing and running of code, as well as snippets and linting. Then I'll do some data analysis with Python and VS Code. I'll be sharing the Jupyter capabilities that we just released in the extension on Thursday, some debugging, unit testing, and running of tasks. And then finally, I'll go through how you set VS Code up for web development, doing some web debugging, and how you work with Docker. So let's dive right into scripting with Python. So I'll get started here. So again, you download code from code.visualstudio.com. When you open VS Code the first time, you get a page that looks something like this. Now I mentioned you need to install the Python extension. It's really easy to do that. You come over here and click the blue Python link. So that's hopefully straightforward. And so that installs the Python extension, and you click OK. It'll reload Visual Studio Code. The Python extension is now installed. You can also get it by going to the Extensions tab, which you can click on the left-hand side. There you'll see the Python extension installed. And just a quick note, there is a little quick start guide in here about how you install Python and a few quick tips and common commands that you want to run. So I mentioned commands. So one of the first things that you need to know about Visual Studio Code is how to use the command palette. So the command palette is just a list of commands that are available. So if you're on a Mac, it's Command-Shift-P. On Windows or Linux, it's Control-Shift-P. And from here, you can type, see all the Python commands that we have. But the first command I'm going to run is to install code on the command prompt so that I can launch it from the terminal. So I'll run that command. Code is installed in the path. And I do this because I actually like to run VS Code from the command prompt. So let's build our first application. So how do I usually do this? first I make a folder, call it new app, go into that folder, and then I type code dot. So that opens the current folder in VS Code, and with that I can start running my first script. So I clicked the create file button. Let me increase the zoom a little bit here. So I click this create file button. I'll name this hello.py, and it prompts me to select my Python interpreter. So I'm going to use Python 3, and then I can type print hello world. And then now I want to run this piece of code. I will right click and say run the Python file in the terminal. The integrated terminal comes up. It runs using the Python 3 interpreter and says hello world. Okay, so just a quick recap. Command palette installed on the path, installed the Python extension, created the file, and ran it in the terminal. Now we'll do a little bit more scripting with Python. So I mentioned the Stack Overflow developer survey in my opening slide. So I'm actually going to download that Stack Overflow survey and do a little bit of scripting with that. So let's go ahead and create a new file called stackoverflow.py in this same folder. Let me resize this to the right. Just need to get rid of this terminal there. All right. So the first thing I want to do is use the requests library. It's a popular library for doing file transfers or HTTP calls. So right away, I get feedback here telling me that the requests library is not installed. And so the first thing I want to do is install the request library. So I'm not going to install the request library into my global Python interpreter, because then other applications may be using the same request library, and maybe I'll have version conflicts for different applications. So I'm going to create a virtual environment. So a virtual environment is a copy of the Python interpreter that has my own set of packages that my application depends on. So I'll open the terminal with control backtick, and the first thing I need to do is create the virtual environment. So I'll create the virtual environment by running Python 3 from the command line, because I want a Python 3 environment. I'll invoke the venv module, which is how you create virtual environments, and I'll name it env. So while that's being created here, you'll notice a folder gets created in VS Code. Here I'll just quickly demystify virtual environments a little bit. There's my Python runtime in that bin folder, and then my site packages are available in my lib folder there. So if I want to activate this environment, I can do that by typing source env bin activate. And now that this environment is activated, you see it indicated there with env beside my command prompt. If I say which Python, you'll see that Python is now running out of this env folder that I've created here. So that's my virtual environment. So I can actually have VS Code now use that virtual environment by clicking on the Python version that I have in the bottom left-hand corner. So if I click on that, the env folder now appears in my list of Python interpreters. Now VS Code's using that. Now when I create a new terminal, it'll automatically put that environment on the path. So now I created that terminal using the plus button. If I say which Python, you'll see that it's running env bin Python there. And just a little bit of a fun fact, if I reload VS Code, you'll see that it again uses that same environment. So it saves that setting, so the next time I open this folder, it'll use that same virtual environment that I created. So now I want to pip install the requests library. So pip is how you install packages. And now I can start using the requests library up here. And you can see that warning went away. So now I can say I will create a new request and say request equals requests dot get, and then so I'm getting IntelliSense here in VS Code. It's giving me parameter completions and things like that. So I want to download the Stack Overflow survey. So to do that, I'm just going to quickly open my browser, pull the link from their website. By the way, they publish all the results of these surveys. There's lots of interesting stuff you can learn from looking at the contents of these surveys. I'll post that URL in there, and then I'll open a file, call it survey 2017.zip. Make sure to open that as a writable binary file, and then we'll say file dot write request dot, what do we got here? Oops. Yeah, it's request.content. All right. So now I want to run this file again. This time when I run the Python file in the terminal, it will activate the virtual environment first, so it's got access to the request library. It'll download that zip file, and it will appear in my file explorer on the left-hand side. Okay, so it's a zip file. I want to unzip that file. So I'm going to write some code that will unzip the file. So I'm not going to make you watch me type through all that. I'm going to use a snippet that I've defined called SO extract. So I've defined these snippets. They appear in my completion list. And you can see here's the code for that snippet there. So if I just press tab, it'll insert that snippet of code in here. And it puts the cursor on the name of the file. It's a parameter, so I can just type survey.csv and hit save. So I want to run this unzip functionality here without re-downloading the survey, because I don't want to wait for the survey to re-download. So if I want to run just this piece of code, I can right-click and say run selection in terminal, or press Shift-Enter. So if I press Shift-Enter, that will open the terminal with the Python REPL, and that will extract the zip file and then turn it into a CSV and clean up the intermediate folder. So just a quick recap, I used the select interpreter command. I ran the file in the terminal. I used snippets, and then I also showed you how you could use Shift-Enter to run the selection in terminal. One thing I didn't have time to show today is linting. So you can run the select linter command, and we've got many different linters built into Visual Studio Code, including Bandit, which was just recently submitted by a member of the community. And these will give you even additional code warnings and errors as you hit save. And I made these slides available. I'll have a link at the end of the talk. So here's some tips on creating virtual environments. So just a quick note that the steps on Windows are a little bit different than the steps on Linux. So I've got that up there. And just another note that you can install, typically packages are saved to a file called requirements.txt when you're working with virtual environments. And you can generate that list by typing pip freeze and outputting that to requirements.txt, and you can install it using the pip install -r command. We also support pyenv, pipenv, and conda environments with Visual Studio Code. So if you're using those, those will work very similar to what you just saw here. And a quick note that as I was working here, I was using a preview feature. It's the Microsoft Python language server. This was providing the completions as I was typing. So this is actually a preview. It's soon to be the default. We're just ironing out the last few bugs. But if you want to try that out today, you can go to your code settings and set the Jedi enabled setting to false. So let's keep going and talk about how we do a little bit of analyzing of the survey data. I've downloaded the CSV file. Let's crack it open and start working with it. So the first thing I'm going to show is the Python interactive window, this new Jupyter feature that we've just announced earlier this week. So I'll close this here. So before I dive into it, if you're not familiar with Jupyter, typically a data scientist will work with a Jupyter notebook that looks something like this, where I've got my code cells all defined, and I can press Shift-Enter to run these code cells, and it gives me the output, and I do some data analysis. However, the extension here of this file type is an IPyNB file, so I can't really work with that in VS Code in my editor. So instead, let me open up a different folder here. So I'll go to this folder where I've done some analysis code. I'll reopen this with code dot. So I've got my IPyNB file here. So if I want to do some analysis of this file, I can do create a new file called analysis.py. This time I'm going to change to an Anaconda environment where I've got Jupyter and Pandas and other data science libraries installed. So I'll select Anaconda there. And the cool thing here is now I can define code cells in my editor by typing %%. So if I type %%, and now get this run cell code lens, where I can put some code in here that says hello Jupyter. And if I press Shift-Enter, that will bring up the Python interactive window. And so this, I'm just going to collapse this left sidebar by clicking on the Explorer. And you see the output from that appears on the right-hand side. So I'm working here with a Python file, so we split the output and the input from the Python file with these cells. And so if I press Shift-Enter, it'll then run another cell, and then it automatically advances to a new cell that I've created. So if I wanted to take that IPyNB file and convert it to these code cells, I could just try and open that Python, that notebook file with a VS Code, and you can see the raw output is this sort of JSON format. It's not very friendly for Git or diffing or things like that. And it gives me the option to import this into a Python file. So I click import, it'll generate, it'll translate that Jupyter notebook into these code cells that I've got defined here. And I'm just going to copy and paste this into my other file that I've created. And now I can run that same analysis using VS Code. Now, just a quick note, it doesn't have the CSV file that I've created here. So I need to copy those CSV files into this current folder. And I'm going to use a feature called tasks. So tasks in VS Code, they're shell commands or other commands that you can define. And so I'm going to use some predefined tasks that I have by using terminal run task. And this allows me to copy the saved surveys that I have saved somewhere else on my folder, and then that's just a handy helper task that I've written. So now I can run this interactive analysis by clicking run cell or pressing Shift-Enter. So let's just take a quick look at some of the survey data here in VS Code. So this is I'm using Pandas, which is a table. It's a library that can analyze CSV files and do operations on the table. And so this is what the raw survey looks like. Every single row has a single response, and all the columns are all of the individuals' responses to the Stack Overflow survey. So I can look at it here in the output. I can also look at the column I'm interested in is the languages that people say they've worked with in the past year. So I press Shift-Enter, and I can see what that column looks like. It's a semicolon delimited list of languages that people have said they've used on the survey. So I want to actually keep going here. Maybe I can turn this into and figure out how many people say they've used Python on the 2018 survey. So I'll run this piece of code that basically splits, oops, a little bug there in my notebook file, splits the semicolon list of strings out into each language is in their own column. So I can see JavaScript, Python, HTML are now in their own column. And now I want to summarize across all those. So now I get the languages with the counts. And for example, this many people said they use C in column 0 and this many in column 1. So now we want to sum across all those columns by using this sum operation with Pandas. So now I finally have the count of how many people say they've used each language. And I can see that 30,000 people say they've used Python. And so quickly, I'll just add a new column that adds a percent by calculating the total number of people who have answered the question, and then dividing the count by the total. So I'll just run that there. And we can see that on the 2018 survey, 38.8% of developers are using Python, which is outstanding. The language is growing like crazy. And then finally, I can also plot that as a bar chart and see all of the languages plotted as a bar chart, all in dark theme here as VS Code is. Okay, so that was a quick tour of the new Jupyter interactive window. Let me just take this now, and I want to actually analyze the last 7 years worth of data that we have for the Stack Overflow survey. I've got a file here called Stack Overflow py, but I'll quickly show a few keyboard shortcuts here. So if I press Command P, this will actually let me switch between all of the different files I have in the workspace. I can select the Stack Overflow.py file. And if I'm in the Stack Overflow.py file, I can press Command-Shift-O to browse through the different symbols that I have here. So that's the open symbol command. I can see I've got methods that define the URLs, the file names for all the different years, the different questions that people specify on all the different years. And then finally, I've got some functions here that I use to analyze the data at the very end. So I'm going to actually use the debugger now to step through this code a little bit. So to use the debugger, I just set a breakpoint there and go to the debug tab and press the play button. press the play button, it starts the debugger, and it's going to run to that breakpoint that I've just set. So now I'm going through this loop where I'm analyzing the survey data from the various years. So I'll just press the run button to let it run once. I can, now that I'm in the debugger, I can look at various variables. I can type expressions in, like totals. I can also use the debug console here to analyze the various years. So I can type totals into the debug console. Notice I got completions in the debug console for the expressions I was typing in. And I can expand the variables there. And I can do things like saying totals 2011 and write other expressions like that. So let's actually step into some code here with the debugger. I can step over individual lines, and then I can also, if I keep stepping here, I'll get to this loop. And I don't want to keep stepping through this loop, so I can use the run to cursor capability to say I want to run to line 83, so I can right-click and say run to cursor. Okay, so that's all good. Now, I'm analyzing all this data. How do I know it's correct? Well, I've got some unit tests here defined for how what this data is supposed to look like. So these tests here, I picked the values off the Stack Overflow website to make sure I'm computing them correctly. And so to use unit test, I'll run Command-Shift-P and run the discover unit test command. For that, and then it will prompt me to configure my unit test framework. So I'm using unit test. My tests are defined in the test folder, so it's just asking me some questions here, and my files are named test_star.py. So after I run that command, I get these really cool unit test code lenses directly in my code that will let me run entire test classes or run individual tests. So if I run this test at the top, here it will come back and say this test passes, and I've got a little bit of a bug in my code, so if I run the second test, it tells me the test fails. So that was some features on how we do debugging, unit testing, some keyboard shortcuts, and tasks. Now we're going to dive into a little bit of web development with Python and Visual Studio Code. And for this, I'm just going to first show you how we take this application and put it into a Flask application to show charts. So let's switch to another version of this app that I have. It's in a folder called Stack Overflow Flask. Again, I'll use the same code.keyboard shortcut. So this takes the data that was output by the previous step that generated a data.json file. And then we have two routes, index.html and an API route that returns the data. So if I want to debug this file, I can't just press F5 and run it because Flask is designed as a WSGI app. It needs all sorts of flags and things like that. So we're going to use debug configurations. To use debug configurations, we can click this debug drop-down here and add a configuration. And we've got predefined configurations for popular Python applications. So for example, we've got a debug configuration for Django. In this case, I've got one for Flask. I just need to customize this quickly because my application is located in app/main.py. And then I can click the play button, and it will then start and sorry, I forgot to change the active debug configuration to a Flask application. And so if I click that, it will start the Flask application. And so it'll put me the URL in the terminal. Quick tip here, you can press Control, click on that. It'll open the browser to the application. And then just to prove it's working, I can set a breakpoint there and refresh. And I'm now debugging the Flask application. So now I want to take all of that I just did and do it using Docker, because actually, fun fact, more than 30% of Python developers use Docker as part of their development tools. So I get this question all the time, how do I use Docker? How do I debug inside of Docker? So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So we have a Docker extension for Visual Studio Code. If you go to the extension marketplace and install it, I'm just going to turn it on, and then that will reload VS Code. And that will add some commands for how we use Docker and various things like that. So I've got this vanilla application here that I have, and I want to Dockerize it. So I'm going to run, again, use the command palette, type Docker, and I'm going to add Docker files to my workspace. This will ask me some common questions, so it'll create those Docker files for me by default. So I'll select Python. We'll put it on port 5000 just for fun, and it'll generate some Docker files for us. Now, I'd like to customize this Docker file a little bit because I need to specify how to run the Flask application. So to do this, I'm going to change the base image. We were talking about WSGI earlier today. I actually want to have a Docker file that includes Nginx in it. So I'm going to, I know this fellow that has published a really good Docker file to Docker Hub. So as I'm typing, I'm actually getting code completions from Docker Hub here, so I don't need to go search online. I can just type things and see what comes up. I'll use this Docker file here that's got a UWSGI and Nginx web server with Flask pre-installed. And then I want to pick my Python version. And so I'll go with Python 3.7 on Alpine Linux so that my Docker image is nice and small. A couple more customizations here. I'm going to define an environment variable. And you notice I get completions as I'm defining those environment variables. I'll tell the Docker container it needs to listen on port 5000. And I'm going to copy my entire working space into the root of the Docker container. And then I don't need a startup command because the base container handles that for me. So now that I'm in, now that I've got my Docker file set up, I want to build and run this Docker container. Well, that's defined by this Docker compose file. So the Docker compose file indicates which Docker file to build, which dot means basically build this Docker file here, what to name the image, and what port to map to the port that the Docker container is listening on. So to run this, I can just right-click and say Docker compose up, and that will build the Docker container, and it will start it up. And once that is built, so basically it's just putting all the different layers of the image together. It's installing my Python packages, and it's creating the Docker image. So it's done that. Now if I head on over to the Docker tab, I can see all the Docker containers that I have running on my local machine, and I can even do operations like start, stop. I can show logs for that Docker container. There's that Nginx startup, the web server starting up, and just to prove it's working, if I refresh this, now the website's running in a Docker container on my machine. I can also attach a shell, so I'm SSH right into that Docker container. I can do ls. I see there's an entry point at sh file. I can run vi inside of the terminal inside of VS Code. So if we want to get real meta here, we can do that. But that's about as far as I'm going to go into that. Okay. So now if I want to do remote debugging in this container, if I want to be able to debug my application, I need to use the VS Code's remote debugger. So I've got a different branch of this where I've added a little bit of configuration here. So let me just switch over to that. First, I'm going to use the Git tab here. I'll select all the changes that I've made. I'll throw those away. So I'll discard those changes. I'll click on this branch in the bottom so I can switch branches to the Dockerized branch. And I'll just quickly show you what this configuration does. So I've checked some additional files into this version of the repo. Basically, what this allows me to do is have a Python run in Docker command that I've created. So when I run that run in Docker command, it's actually going to start up the Docker container. It will launch the remote debugger inside of the Docker container, and then it will attach VS Code's remote debugger into the Docker container. So now if I click the web application here, I just got to set that breakpoint again. I can do the same thing I just did, but now I'm hitting breakpoints inside of the Docker container. I can type, I get debug completions, all that same stuff. So I've made the sample code and configurations available for how you can do this with VS Code as part of the links that I have in the slides. Okay, that was a whirlwind tour of all the different features I could cram into 30 minutes. I really appreciate you taking the time to look at this today. I didn't have time to check out, to share with you Visual Studio Live Share, so I want to remind you that we've got real-time collaborative editing and debugging capabilities if you install that extension. And if you want to learn more about what Microsoft is doing with Python and VS Code in Azure or Visual Studio, check out our Python blog, and the codes and slides are all available here. Thank you so much.